I am so pleased that we're part of Wisdom Week. I remember talking with Michelle Gare and Son Gornhammer almost, it seemed like months ago, and we talked about his idea of a Wisdom Week, and we talked about our participating, and this is wonderful that you're all here. Let me tell you just a little bit about where you are, for those of you who have not been to CIIS before, the California Institute of Integral Studies. Part of the history is on the wall over there, and we are 45 years old as CIIS, and prior to that was the American Academy of Asian Studies, and that was founded for the study of wisdom traditions. And one of the many areas that we consider ourselves to be at least founded for and we study is the whole area of wisdom, which tonight you will have an opportunity to hear from our professors. Let me just tell you three things about CIIS. First, it's a university, and we give undergraduate degrees in the School of Undergraduate Studies, and we give master's degrees and doctoral degrees in the School of Consciousness and Transformation and the School of Professional Psychology and Health. So in that aspect, you are meeting the professors who teach in our academic programs. We also have public programs and performances, of which is sponsoring this evening, and there are materials over there to tell you both about the academic programs and about the public programs and performances. And if you take a look at that, you'll see so many of the themes that you will be following at the Wisdom 2.0 conference. Many of the speakers, in fact, many of the teachers that will be there are people who speak regularly here. So I want to draw you to that. And then thirdly, we have 6 counseling centers in San Francisco. And this is in the area of counseling psychology, of which we educate more counseling psychologists than any university in the world, in counseling psychologists and clinical psychologists. And our students, I'm very proud to say, when they take the state exams, finish #1 on the California licensing. So we have a program that has been very significant in terms of healing in San Francisco, and certainly have become a part of San Francisco. So welcome to this aspect of Wisdom 2.0, and I'm going to introduce you now to Professor Meg Jordan.
Hello and welcome. Thank you, Jim. Thank you all for coming this evening. It's really great that you've invested your time and your energy in delving more into this question of wisdom, especially in our hurry-up, accelerated era. We really appreciate the alliance with Wisdom 2.0 and the fact that we were able to do this as a affiliated event for all the exciting events going on this week. So welcome, CIIS. Gathered here are 4 professors representing distinct specialties. Each of them have been a program director or is currently a program director of the department in which their discipline resides. And because they each represent a different philosophy, spiritual practice, wisdom tradition, some of them ancient, some of them ongoing, some of them contemporary, it's a really exciting thing to be able to introduce you to these, because we know it's been Soren Gothammer's founder of Wisdom 2.0 to really look at how to make this connection between the new mindfulness research and practices we see now and innovation, and sort of teach business that the old ways don't always work. What are the new ways of connecting and finding self and going deep and creating authentic community and a sense of peace? So what has been Tech's answer to this? Well, I tend to think as a medical anthropologist that it's been another flurry of hurry-up apps to help you relax. We have another approach here. What we want to do is create a real alliance with that tech sector and say, for those of you who are interested and maybe going deeper, going into a line of inquiry that involves integral education, embodied practice, rigorous scholarship, community service, all the facets that integral philosophy means to us here at CIIS, well, we offer you this taste of wisdom practices. So thank you for joining us. And with that, I'm just going to introduce everybody. Ready? the wisest of all here is Professor Robert McDermott, who is absolutely a world-class scholar in his fields and represents the entire canon of Western philosophy that we know in a classical sense, and especially extraordinary writings on Sri Aurobindo, who's sort of the spiritual innovative founder of why CIIS is even here, and Rudolf Steiner, which he can also, is going to get some questions from me about. Maybe some of you know that name too. Alka, no, I'm going to introduce Professor Craig Chalquist next, who heads up, Robert heads up, directs our program here called Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness. It is both a master's and PhD program, and he'll tell you more about himself too. Promise? Yes.
Do what I'm told.
That's how he stays out of trouble. Professor Craig Chalquist, next to him, represents the Earth for us tonight. He is a professor and director of the East-West Psychology program, in which he has some ideas about renaming things that signify the broader reach and scope that the program really holds. He is an expert in something called Terra psychology. I'm going to fascinate you with his ideas of myth and archetype and how it leads us to connect to the Earth and its wisdom. Professor Alka Arora, the gorgeous gal here, right? And she is actually the director of our Women's Spirituality program, which is undergoing some morphing and including a broader scope as well. Probably going to have a name, something like Gender, Women's Spirituality, and Social Justice. It's in the process of that right now. Heads up a master's program and a PhD program. And she'll tell you more about her specialties too. And finally, our beloved trickster at the end, Professor Stephen Goodman, who is a world-class scholar in Buddhist Indo-Tibetan traditions, is what we call him. Especially Mahayana tradition and Vajra. Say the other one.
Just say Tantra and everybody will know it.
And get them more excited as well. Okay. More from Stephen soon. So as you see these four professors, you know, you can think classical philosophy, contemporary eco-psychology, gender and women and social justice, and extraordinary contemplative Buddhist practices that actually lead to joy and contentment. 4 distinct areas. How exciting to see them all represented here. You're going to have a chance to ask them a lot of questions, but right now I'm asking them to each kick off with at least 10 minutes, and I'm a good timekeeper with 1 question to them each, all right? In the order that you're seated. So for Professor McDermott, is wisdom an abandoned ideal in the 21st century?
An abandoned ideal.
Mm-hmm.
I guess. Is that better? Can you hear?
Yes.
It's on? You can hear it. Okay. If you can't, raise your hand. Okay. Is wisdom an abandoned idea? Well, not recently. It was abandoned in the West in about the 16th century, I guess, would be the best place to put that. Maybe Francis Bacon. When the West began to identify knowledge with power and utility, usefulness, knowledge became useful. It was always useful, but it was understood to be primarily or essentially useful. The criterion of knowledge became then useful. And that's been the dominant view increasingly, and certainly by the 18th, 19th century, it was established and hasn't been seriously challenged since. The major challenge goes by the name Romanticism. So the great conflict is between Enlightenment, which was the 18th century version of knowledge worth having, and the 19th century generally then witnessed this attempt to introduce wisdom as a counter to knowledge, which is sort of the highest level. There wasn't anything above it deserving to be called wisdom. and what knowledge was just useful, power, effect, etc. So in philosophy, psychology, certainly social sciences, I would even say in science in the West, there's scarcely any attention to wisdom as a meaningful inquiry, and to claim to have attained it, or for someone else to attain it, is, I would say, in our culture, highly suspect. So the paradigm, the way of seeing the world, interpreting the world, and the way we behave in relation to that knowledge is pretty much, does not have much need, or thinks it has very little need, if any, for wisdom. So it's kind of exciting to have somebody like His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who is identified with wisdom. But of course, he's in the West, blessedly, but not a Westerner. So, but we don't have very many, if any, people who we as a culture, or even a subculture, identify as wise. And we immediately think of the Dalai Lama in terms of wisdom and compassion. And I, for one, think of him as not just having wisdom, but being somehow an instantiation, a making real of wisdom. That's kind of exciting. Then we could go on and talk about how that's possible. How could he be that, and what is it like, and how come he has that and we don't, we being the West. So we're sort of getting it from him. Anyway, I don't know if you want me to talk more.
I have another question for you. Yeah. Your 10 minutes are not up. And this question really has to do with evolving consciousness. Because you've looked at Rudolf Steiner, you've looked at Sri Aurobindo, and both of them have had this sort of sense that move the ideas forward in life.
Well, they are both evolutionary. Aurobindo, Steiner, Teilhard de Chardin, I think of as the three most emphatic, confident evolutionary thinkers. Big systems, you know, with an intelligible past and an intelligible present, leading somewhere to some better goal. And they certainly have a hope that it will all work out, and their favorite terms for the future will come to be, but there is no, they don't think it's determined. I don't think any of them think it's determined, but they have the hope that it will work. And if it does work, then yes, that would be the triumph of wisdom. Aurobindo uses the term the life divine and supermind, and Teilhard talks about the omega point. Steiner is like many phases, each one perhaps leading to some greater wisdom, but always with some great struggle and undermining and challenging and temptations which could thwart. So no guarantee.
No great trajectories. Some of our audience, could you raise your hand if you're part of a tech business community or interesting? And the rest, scholars, students? Let's see. Okay, so it's a nice mix. Some of you in tech might know about Kurzweil's singularity, some ideas of the, the strange attractor that pulls us forward in terms of evolving consciousness as well. Do you think that there's anything in this current paradigm that contributes to wisdom? Or is it just all unhappiness with modern thinking?
I'm not so thrilled with the option, with the alternative, that particular choice.
I know, you have 4 minutes to answer.
Okay. Here comes option number 3. So I think that text as such, or technology as such, is not wisdom any more than any other brilliant, practical, efficient achievement is in itself wise. But I use the word brilliant deliberately. It is brilliant and getting more brilliant and more exciting and more, in a certain sense, alluring. And I think it's the case that every great advance brings with it a shadow dimension. And so in the case of technology, the brilliance is enabling us to communicate and share and solve problems and do amazing, amazing things. More amazing than I understand, but I certainly see them and admire them. But the shadow dimension is that it can, like anything else that's new and exciting, it can challenge our interiority, our independence, our romantic dimensions. It's not obvious that it will, or that it is, but it's certainly an important question. And the wisdom, I think, with respect to technology is depends on our ability to be both brilliant, technologically brilliant, and not be kind of overwhelmed. I'm very nervous about middle schoolers who are just really just really tied to their iPhones.
Device,
texting in their pockets and such. I don't think there's a lot of time to think about too many other things. I'm not a middle schooler. I'm not even a parent of a middle schooler. But I'm concerned about something that's so seductive.
Yeah, as long as you're talking about children, are children actual sources of wisdom for you? You're a grandparent.
I love my grandchildren. I love my children. I don't know that the wisdom that our culture needs is likely to come from children, because the wisdom we need needs to be addressed to our adult temptations, which has to do with violence and shortcuts of all kinds. So I don't know that children have a wonderful intuitive capacity if they're not already squashed by schools and technology or parents. But I think they're not able to give us wisdom in the areas where we're making terrible, terrible mistakes.
How about the elderly? Just because you're growing old doesn't mean you're wise, does it?
No, alas. It's fairly standard to get old before wise. So, yeah, the wise can have the ability to take a big picture, which is hard to do when they're young. But the elderly can also be squashed by circumstances, can also be fearful, can also have given up their romantic imagination in order to cope and survive.
Oh,
Good.
thank you.
It could happen.
It's a beautiful segue. You're handing over
Okay.
your microphone.
Okay. Thank you. Great questions.
Thank you. Yes, they were. So, he wrote some of them. And I want to give credit where credit's due. Squashing the imagination, quashing the imagination, which really is a beautiful segue to Professor Craig Chalquist, as I said, chair of the East-West Psychology Program, and some of our most imaginative work there goes on there in eco-psychology and depth psychology, and ecotherapy and mythology. And Craig has looked hard and fast at the weaving of ancient myth and archetypal legend and how it can shed light on contemporary events and on wisdom itself here. So when the imagination is feeling quashed, how do we reinvigorate?
I think, well, what helps me anyway is to get back in touch with some of the old stories. Current ones too. I mean, when I was training as a psychotherapist, I didn't hear this too much until the end of my training, but a lot of our theories talked about the neurological basis for the psyche and other things that we need to know. Those are important layers to it. But a lot of them were from the outside. And since then I've come to think of the psyche as being made of story, actually. So we respond to story because it's who we are, it's our nature. And so sometimes to get my imagination going again when it's threatening to get a little bit numb, I look at ancient myths because I think they have a lot of wisdom that gets overlooked in our culture. In fact, our culture so disparages myth that in English, in American English, myth has come to mean a lie. Whereas a myth, the way it's usually held by traditional people, is as a sacred story of some kind that can tell us things. And in that I would compare a myth to a dream. I think similar tools can be used to understand both. And I'm thinking of my psychotherapy days with a client who was having trouble with a dream because both dream and myth speak in a metaphoric language of symbols, unlike our linear left-brain thinking. So the potential integral value in studying myth is that it complements our left-brain thinking with, and I'm speaking metaphorically about this too, about our more right brain, in quotes, ways of processing things. So the client I'm thinking about was very good at her job. She was in, as I recall, this was a long time ago, but she was in marketing. She was very good at it. She hated it. And she came in and didn't connect her anxiety attacks with what she might be doing for a living. And she had a recurrent dream of window shopping for a new outfit. She was a really sharp dresser, and she would wear a certain kind of outfit to work as part of her job as a marketer. And in the nightmare that she had, she kept seeing a mannequin in a store window with her face. So that was her introduction to the idea that not only that her job was freezing her soul and that she needed to find something more fulfilling, but that dream and myth both are our mentors in thinking not just in linear terms, but in symbol and metaphor. They both tell the story exactly of what's happening between each other and our relationship to the natural world, but they do it symbolically. So that's the trick in trying to figure out what they're saying.
You know, you've talked before on this concept of Terra psychology as well, and how the landscape seems to keep recreating the story that feeds you. Can you give some idea about how stories recreate themselves, and particularly in relation to the earth?
There's a story that we're going to be talking about in a class I'm teaching right now called Archetypal Mythology. And very often nature is very present in myth, and some myths can do different things. They can tell us what to do about contemporary problems, not in literal specific terms, but just as problems that humans have always faced. And they can also tell us paths we shouldn't go down. So as an example of that, there's an old Greek story about a king named Erisichthon. And the ironic thing about this story, by the way, is he has the word chthon in his name, which means earth. And he got inflated one day and he decided that he just needed to build a bigger and bigger and bigger palace. So he began using up all the resources, as we would say these days, in his country. And eventually, he ordered his men to cut down the sacred groves of Demeter, who is the goddess of all the things that grow in the world.
His first mistake.
Yeah, a big mistake. And so one of the goddesses who was watching him do this, her name, you probably heard at some point, it was Nemesis, the restorer of balances. And there's probably most or all of the gods and goddesses of mythology have to do with restoring balances, but the style of Nemesis is to restore them quickly and painfully, right? So she cursed Erisichthon with a hunger that was insatiable as a result of his logging activities. And so he ate all the food in his kingdom, and then he ate all his subjects, and then he ate his family, and then he ate himself, and he was gone. So there's several lessons here, I think, just in terms of what happens when you're so hungry for planetary resources that you eat all of them and end up eating yourself. With regard to Terra psychology, it's a word I coined several years ago to refer to how deep our psychological connections are to the lands we live and work on, mostly unconscious connections, but still powerful. And I would just like to give a single example of Terra psych thinking, which is that we now are in the Bay Area, which is the largest estuary on the West Coast, and an estuary is a place ecologically where they're hugely productive edge places, meeting places. Saltwater and freshwater come together there. species that would never have met anywhere else come together there. Just incredible, ecologically cosmopolitan, one might say, meeting places. So the Terra psychology move is to ask a question, which is, in what way is an ecological estuary like the San Francisco Bay Area also a cultural, psychological, and even spiritual estuary too for the people who live here? And when we ask that question, we get all kinds of interesting parallels coming up between the places where we live and the things that we do there.
I love this. I think it's, I bonded with my brother Craig here when I gave a lecture in integrative health talking about how the continental plate and the Pacific plate are butted up against each other here. And it creates an agitation. We all know it's the San Andreas Fault. It also creates a huge pebble in your shoe for growth and development. If you find yourself agitated going to 6 or 7 workshops every month and always gathering new knowledge and trying to assimilate it and integrate it and all, well, welcome to the Bay Area. We have a certain wonderful agitation here to learn, grow, stretch. And when you can hold on to that and fasten to some of the mythology and Terra psychology, it helps you make some meaning and some sense of things. Why does that matter to people?
Well, I think it gives us a sense of our place in the world, which is something that we're increasingly missing. It's funny, I was having a conversation with my dad a while ago, and he said, "What in the hell is Terra psychology?" And I love it that I've kidded him about this. My dad's first name is Kurt, and that's him, right? So look at what your name is, by the way. There's some interesting mythology if you take it far back enough. But anyway, I said, well, here's an example of it. I said, you and Mom have actually lived in California for longer than I have. They came out from Nebraska, but they've been here longer. And I said, but I was born here. And do you remember that time when I was a starving doctoral student and I was broke all the time? And I did my dissertation in a tool shed. You know, that time when I never seemed to, I got stressed about it, but I always knew that money would come in or that things would happen. And Dad used to ask me how I could live like that. And I said, well, in the California psyche is the fact, deep down, that we live on the edge of the continent. There is no further you can go here except right into the Pacific Ocean. And we have the San Andreas Fault, which is named after the saint who got pulled apart in different directions. We have that. And pretty much all of the geology from Nevada to here is driftwood, so to speak. It's accumulated island arcs that got swept out of the ocean as the North American continent moved. So everything here is new compared to the rest of the continent. It's new and it's edgy. And there's something, I think, anyway, in the Californian psyche that expects rupture. We expect surfaces to shift. I don't panic when earthquakes happen. And so I told them it's always been that way for us, especially for Native people who lived here for pretty much ever. They know this too. And my dad went, that's interesting. So knowing that, I know something about my relationship to this land, and it gives me a sense of, even in a land of rupture and newness, it gives me a groundedness that I wouldn't have otherwise. And it also gives me a sense of why my vocation is unfolding here rather than elsewhere.
Thank you. Thank you for that. A sense of groundedness allows me to say, time to hand over. Again, Professor Alka Arora is the director, program chair of our Women's Spirituality program, which is also a gender, women's spirituality, and social justice. Her research includes spiritual activism and multiculturalism and feminist theory. And I really honor the way you are holding up a wisdom tradition here, because people often think of wisdom and say, wow, that's a long succession of males. Aristotle, Plato, Tennyson, Dalai Lama, you know, and they can rattle off 30 names of men. And where are the women in the wisdom traditions? And after that, I want to go into some spiritual bypassing talk with you too. But at first, if you could really look at the study of gender, spirituality, and social justice, and just how it relates to the attainment of wisdom.
Thank you. So one of the things that I thought about when I thought about preparing for today was what is really at the core of the Women's Spirituality program and what we try to teach here. And I would say it's really this integration of this idea of wisdom or inner spiritual development with critical thinking about power. And usually when we think about, spirituality and critical movements for social justice, they're often seen as in opposition to each other. And in some ways, they rely upon, metaphorically, again, as Craig noted, different sides of the brain in order to access our, depth of wisdom. Sometimes means we need to sort of quiet down the more rational parts of our brain. But I think that what's really needed as we move forward in this current age is bringing those two together. And what we do when we take this critical thinking about power and we look at wisdom traditions, we ask ourselves, whose voices have been considered wise? And whose voices have been passed down historically? And we see that oftentimes it's been, as you noted, the male. And I would also say it's not just been the men, it's also been the elite men, whatever the priestly caste has been of any given culture. And so when you take a feminist perspective or a critical perspective on that, you start to ask, who are the other voices that we haven't heard from? And that's not to negate the voices of the male spiritual teachers, whom we've all learned so much from, myself included, but it's to see that as a partial picture and not a complete picture. And so then we have to look at who have the women mystics been throughout time. It's also looking at the wisdom that comes from oral traditions, from indigenous traditions that have been suppressed under colonization, and folk traditions. So it's really about looking at subaltern and submerged knowledges as sources of wisdom. And so when we apply critical thinking to the question of wisdom historically, I would argue that it democratizes the concept of wisdom. And I think that's really important today, not just when we look at so-called teachers and historical figures, but democratizing the wisdom of our contemporary times. And you asked earlier, if I may, as a feminist, break the rules here a little bit, the question that you asked Robert about the technological age. I think that one of its benefits, although it does have challenges for sure, is that it has democratized our access to knowledge. Mm-hmm. Now, if it's democratized our access to wisdom, remains to be seen. But I think there's some potential there.
Thank you. Mindfulness-based stress reduction has been the darling of the Wisdom 2.0 conference. I think the founder fell in love with John Kabat-Zinn, brought him in, and has been trying to introduce mindfulness in every corporate practice there is. You, with your kind of deep-seated spiritual practice, I believe it's Buddhist contemplative, is it right?
Largely, yes.
Largely, all right.
Yeah.
A contemplative practice of any case, all right. We have similar feelings about what happens when mindfulness is used as a tool for feeling better, but not radical transformation. It seems to get bypassed.
Right, so I'm glad that you brought that up, because the other thing that I think about is when we don't take our critical thinking about power into our contemporary searches for spirituality, I think we often can result in spiritual materialism and spiritual bypassing. So in the concept of mindfulness, the concept has become very psychologized and very secularized. And I actually don't think that that's all bad. I think there's a lot of positives to that. I think that the introduction of the concept of mindfulness, which originates from Buddhism, coming into the healthcare fields and coming into the stress reduction fields, I think that's wonderful. I think the problem is that when it stops there, and it becomes simply a tool for individual adjustment to a stressful situation, or to a fundamentally, sometimes an unjust situation. It may be helping one adjust rather than actually question. And the other teachings, the Buddha really emphasized not just meditation, but also sangha, or community. And I think that's one of the things that's often been missing as it's become used as a tool for just an individual therapy or adjustment or stress reduction.
Great. Thank you. So much of what our tech sector really prides itself now is more equal opportunities for everybody in the workplace, more passionate communication. There's a company called Zappos. I believe he's one of the speakers at the conference, at the larger conference. And they have 10 core values. They're really exciting. Even Twitter has within its mission statement that or one of its core values, that we passionately communicate with each other with a certain openness. But a lot of these values are often thwarted by the really high stress workload that goes on there. And how can feminism itself serve the workplace as a spiritual tradition?
Excellent question. And I did not give her that question. Well, I think that, one of the most, I think for women who have relative privilege in the West and in other parts of the world as well, the question becomes, how do I have it all, right? And
Lean
so,
in.
right. So, as we've gained more and more power in the workplace, we're often still expected to be the ones to, take care of the home and children and aging parents and so on and so forth. And I think, in generations past, there was this idea that, the man would go out and he could put in 40, 50, 60 hours because there was someone in the home basically subsidizing his labor, right, by doing the laundry and doing the cooking. And now I think what's happened is that both folks are expected to work 40, 50, 60, 80 hours, right? And who's subsidizing the labor now is often low-paid nannies, service workers, so on and so forth. And yet everyone is still stressed out, right? So I think I think the first thing that can happen is, I think we see a lot more activism happening around, women having maternity leave and time off, but then there's always that fear that, is that going to hold me back in the workplace? And I think really maybe what needs to happen is for men to start demanding time off for their families. And I really think that happens not so much from a top-down perspective, but from people starting to shift what they're valuing. And valuing that both men and women are able to find balance in terms of family and also work.
Thank you. Thank you. It reminds me of the New York Times article, did we all see it this weekend, talking about the equitable partnership, saying, watch out, there's no sex anymore. We are offering a new PhD in human sexuality to help to address that soon in fall. The baton gets passed to Professor Stephen Goodman, who has really been able to explore the depths of Buddhist traditions and has really come across ways to say, where is joy and contentment in all this? As we look at the attainment of wisdom, very often joy is overlooked, but you've really done a beautiful inquiry into that. Can you share that with us?
I'll try.
So joyfully.
And I'm in the Department of Asian and Comparative Studies.
Can you tell us more about that?
Part of Philosophy and Religion Department, goes all the way back to the founders here, a vision of Haridas Chaudhuri and some of his colleagues who really had a world integral vision that the very best of Asian traditions and non-Asian traditions were now needing to collaborate. And this was many, many years ago. It was a great honor to be part of this multiple perspective, passionate community of learners. So if you don't know about CIIS, maybe this is just a little catalytic introduction. Joy's on the horizon there. A couple of quick things. Nemesis. Remember? Nemesis. I was at you can't escape Greek mythological realities, and it came to me about 15 years ago when, in a universe not so far from here, I was on a Buddhist retreat at a place where we would all go to eat, and we went in, and the wait person, she said to us, "Hi, I'm your waitress." I think she said waitress. "Hi, I'm your waitress, and my name's Nemesis." And we looked at her, and she said, "Yeah, I know, my parents were hippies, and they never got clear on the Greek mythology." So that's good. Guilt-ridden, joy-challenged seems to be part of the Atlas-like burden of a disconnected, not yet Gaia tradition that's usually associated with the West. Joy challenge, guilt-ridden. There's a really, really great book by Demayeux, a French social historian, with the cheery title of A History of Guilt Culture from the 11th to 18th Century. has great quotes that in northern France, come to know thyself so you'll know what a truly miserable being you are. It's like, the lapsed Unitarian in me took great offense at that. You know? So we do have this kind of tradition. One of the earliest occasions that I had to speak the three-letter word joy in a corporate setting was, and I forget the karmic connections here, I got invited to go down to Apple and give a talk for one of their lunch groups. And the title was The Joyful Art of Downsizing Anxiety. Okay? And so I went and we had a, just get in touch and we did all that stuff. And I left. And then at 5 o'clock that same day, they laid off like 1,500 people.
Wow.
And it was like, oh my God. These are garland of non sequiturs, by the way, in case you're wondering.
We'll get a question soon. What are the causes
Joy.
of suffering?
Joy is an antidote. So joy is many different things. In a more technical Buddhist context, everyone's heard of loving kindness, or you will soon if you haven't, compassion. Then there's joy and equanimity, and if I might, the focus for loving kindness is to really focus on oneself and others, connecting to happiness and sources of happiness. You're thinking about happiness. Compassion is a technical term. Is focusing on yourself and others to be disconnected from suffering and sources of suffering. Ajahn Jumian, a great forest Thai monk, said that in times of great war and conflict, loving kindness is not enough. One needs compassion. One needs to find the spiritual resources to be present when there is great amounts of suffering, passions, to be with those passions, compassionate. And the only reason that one doesn't have that capacity currently, he said, is because one has fear. And then he said, and the only reason we have fear is because we haven't yet tasted the deathless state. And he was saying this in Thai, and Jack Kornfield at Spirit Rock was translating for him, and we're all going, wow. Yeah. And so we hear these kind of generic terms about compassion and loving kindness. I'm so interested in dealing, as I have for the last 30 years or so, with living traditions of Buddhism. You rarely hear about joy. Now, more is coming to the fore. And joy has its target, focusing in oneself and others on the experience of well-being, joy, happiness, and it's said to be an antidote to jealousy. And so what's said is that if one is always trying to measure how you're doing, this really applies to the corporate world a lot, and then feeling somebody's getting over on you and it's not joyful, it's very stressful. So we might say in a corporate context, which is not the totality of why we're here, the wisdom aspect of joy as an antidote to a certain kind of anxiety and suffering is to find, if you have any experiential reference, yourself or others, to locate moments of joy. I used to encourage people to do a joy journal, and sometimes it'd be blank, right? It's like it's simulating, it's like, loitering, it's mental loitering to think about joy. How can you, when the world's so bad, you should go out and organize, not knowing the connection between the release of great resources and also, finally, the extreme they take, and His Holiness the Dalai Lama is very good on this, to take joy in all beings' experiences of joy, including, finally, those who temporarily we regard as being our enemies. And at least as a Gedanken, a what-if experiment, it's very, very interesting to see what happens if those we regard as oppositional or a competitor is taken as a target for generating a sense of joy. And the reason it's possible because all beings want the same thing, as Dalai Lama says. They want love, they want happiness, they don't know how. So joy, or focusing on the real achievements, the well-dones, the amazing things that can happen sometimes in that short interval, very, very short interval known as being alive, will release and sort of redo, now we say neuroplasticity, being able to find other sources of heretofore hidden joy. And so it reduces suffering, it relieves stress, and it makes your ability to deal with competitors wilier. You know, you're not so oppositional. It's like conflict resolution.
Not so oppositional. Yeah. It's amazing. I love the way you touch upon the in the service of all beings. That what's the word? Bodhicitta.
Yeah. Well, we can talk English here. The altruistic wish for well-being.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And which leads me to a question for all of you now. Everybody pipe in. The difference between an individual pursuit of wisdom, joy, contentment, and one that is more in service of the collective, more collective oriented. Which of your traditions, spiritual practices, gives attention to the collective over the individual?
Well, you know, the thing that I was thinking about while Stephen was speaking about, you know, the sort of the joylessness of sometimes the corporate world and also like the activist world, right? Because there's always a struggle and there's always something we're fighting for. And I think that the really thing that's interesting is it struck me once when I was in graduate school that, you know, if we had our feminist revolution and we had what we wanted, then what? Right? What is it that we want? You know, we want, you know, not just equality, but we all, as all beings want, is to be happy and to have well-being. And I think we really need to keep that in mind when we think about, for instance, social movements that are so focused on after we gain whatever it is that we're trying to gain, then we can allow ourselves to play and be happy and have joy, as opposed to having joy be the path. Not to, you know, negate the fact that struggle is a part of life and suffering is a very real part of life, and there are times we have to, you know, prioritize one thing over play, but to not forget that, you know, we don't need to keep postponing our joy till after the struggle has been achieved. And that's something that I think about, you know, as a feminist and as a woman of color, that every moment that I can have joy means that I'm moving my cause forward. And I think that's also serving the collective. So, thank you.
The problem of the individual and society, or the collective, to me was poignantly thematized after World War I in Freud's, Freud, he's a guy that, you know, sometimes we can read. Civilization, Its Discontents, in his more modern version, Herbert Marcuse, Eros and Civilization. We have these drives that we're not in charge of. There's a kind of chthonic upheaval that's going on all the time. And a life well lived is we haven't totally freaked out, right? That's about it. I don't know where that falls on the Maslow scale. Yeah, there's a Richter scale on the Maslow scale. How do you reconcile this? And in the contemporary context, and the Buddha, who was the historical Buddha, who was an advisor to kings and oligarchs and all different kinds, really suggested that one look deeply into what they think is the ground of their personal motivation. He said it's largely unconscious karmic drives, which is the collective inheritance, which you can find out about later, and then one can read Jung to find out how to do that, okay? And that one is always in community. I mean, there are isolated yogis and yoginis, but one is always, so that one can make a strong argument that even strong, single-minded contemplative practices, the Vita Contemplata that Hannah Arendt talks about, the Christian traditions, etc., are always completely supported by society which recognizes the value of quiet time for the renewal of the highest values, so that the personal depth work is seen as seeding future shoots that then can be harvested by the collectivity.
Personal depth work. Well, it's been said that our culture suffers from attention deficit disorder, not just individuals. Who's got a remedy for how to go about introducing people to personal depth work in an age of attention deficit? You probably do.
Go ahead, I'll go.
I was going to be a smartass about looking at the fantasy of cures, but on a serious note, I think sometimes our symptoms impel us that way. I'm not in a hurry to get rid of symptoms unless they're a safety issue. You know, they're endangering people, but I mean, if you're so depressed you can't get out of bed, you can't work on yourself either, so you need something, obviously. But in our culture, we tend to forget that a symptom is also a signal. And it's often a signal of deep discontentment about something in our lives. So for me, and I was trained in the traditions of depth psychology, which includes mythology and the other things I talked about earlier. And in the eyes of that tradition, the symptom is something to be paid attention to, and when we suffer enough, then we begin to transform. It doesn't always take that. Some people do it without that. When I was a trainee therapist, we always wished for the clients who just wanted to work on themselves. You know, why are you in here? Self-realization. All right, give me that client. I'll take that one, you know. But they usually don't. They come in because their marriages are falling apart, or they hate themselves, or their kids are driving them nuts, or whatever. So there's a wisdom in the symptom that prompts us forward into asking ourselves, you know, are we ready for the deep change now, or are we going to just try to make things better and go back to our normal way of functioning?
Thank you. Introducing one to personal depth work. You have many decades as a philosopher and as an educator and as a mentor of people doing dissertation work, which is a personal depth work itself. How do you mentor individuals into that state?
Well, apart from the reference to civilization and its discontents, I really liked what Stephen said. I don't know what exactly your relationship was to Freud in that moment, but because I think that's a very unfortunate book and not helpful for us. But so much else that Stephen said about in direct response to this question, I would have been tempted to say. So I'll put it in my own terms. I think you were asking about the collective overwhelming the individual, and of course the individual can either successfully overwhelm or try to overwhelm the community, but the answer would seem to be the middle way, whether it be Buddhist or some other tradition. Aristotle's very good on the middle way. So as I see it, the individual and some larger reality, social or earth, or set of ideas or tradition, family, those relationships are, or those poles, if you want to say, are distinct, but they're not separable. So the idea of the society without distinct, unique individuals, I think, is not a society at all. It's collective. And the idea that an individual would be an island or a silo or a discrete solipsistic entity is false. So the truth has to lie in the intimate, dynamic, mutually enhancing relationship between the two. And I think all the great thinkers affirm that. Though when Freud gets a little cranky in his old age, he sort of lost track. Yeah. But all the other great thinkers, I think, and all the great religious traditions, psychological teachings, I think, really are on the side of the intimate, positive relationship between individual and some larger context or framework. At least that's the way I see it.
That's the way you see it, and your colleague begs to differ? Go ahead.
No, no.
No? Begs to agree?
We've been dialoguing for
Good.
just being stimulated by what everyone said, there's a someone who was nominated by Martin Luther King for the Nobel Peace Prize, Thich Nhat Hanh, who is still walking the earth, who got introduced once by my good friend Wes Nitzker. He activates pacifists and he pacifies activists. And he coined the term, kind of a translation, but in a kind of language that I think a teenager could understand. Interbeing, I-N-T-E-R, being, that we are with others, that who we are is part of this dance, this circle of life, and that you know, in the West, you've heard the phrase, we rely on the kindness of strangers, in the Southern accent. So we have in Western as well as Eastern context an understanding that the individual, well, Robert put it very well, was never a monadic, solipsistic, Leibnizian kind of despairing nodal point, except at certain points when you're working on your PhD. But aside from that, in which case I always tell them two things, but you have to be careful how you do this when you tell somebody who's really high stressed, and this would work in the business world too. You have to be very careful, because if you hit the point before or after, it won't work. You tell them, the universe doesn't care like what you're doing, and this work that you're doing, it's not about you. But if you're careful, that can open it up to the wider surround. But, you know, some training is necessary.
Training necessary, getting in touch with the interbeing. I love that concept. I want to bring it back a little bit into some of the solution-oriented ways in which the harsh realities of what people are undergoing out there, which even fuels a conference like Wisdom 2.0. So many critics fear right now that the constant barrage of social media messaging can sort of trivialize the complexity of these long respected human tasks of building character, of deepening our relationships, of having contemplative time. The constant barrage of social media messaging. Who undergoes that? Anybody feel that you're not part of it, need to be part of it? Who's Twittered in here? Tweeted, sorry. Yes, few of you. I'm on Twitter, and I don't have any followers because I don't go anywhere. It's still, yeah. But I do know that this long-respected human tasks of things like building character and deepening our relationship takes time. Where is the time in a media-barraged world? You know? I think if what we want to do now is really open up questions from anybody out there to our esteemed colleagues. Yes. Adrian.
Adrian.
I'd like to get you a microphone first, yeah.
Doesn't reach far enough, I don't think.
Yeah, on wires.
Hi. So, all wonderful. I don't know if I missed it, but it seemed to me that the entire discussion would have been well served by beginning with a definition of what wisdom is and a comparison of wisdom and knowledge, especially with regard to McDee's initial introduction of when wisdom tradition was lost back in the 16th century and like that. So I think that you know, beginning with definitions is important so we know what page we're on, and I would like to hear a definition of wisdom as opposed to knowledge.
Would you like to take that? You just wrote a beautiful one in that essay.
I'll try. Yeah, I did write an essay. Oh, yeah, look. Thank you.
Media.
Right. I'm all for it, honest. So I did write an essay on wisdom in Western philosophy, which doesn't necessarily answer the question, what is wisdom in general? It's just what is it, or what has it been in Western philosophy? So I'll try to answer the philosophy part, and then I'll try to give you one general answer. So in the essay on wisdom in Western philosophy, I suggested that wisdom is deep knowledge deep knowledge that leads to creative, beneficial action, and that the action issuing from deep knowledge is then a source, it could be a corrective or it could be a confirmation of whether the knowledge is really deep. So this is, you could say it's a definition, but I really think of it more as a characterization. The difference being that a definition really says what it is and what it isn't. And I think characterization is better because it's a description that deliberately allows for other features to emerge and to come into view. And I think wisdom is sufficiently large that it's almost certainly the case that if we try to define it, we will give some characteristics and leave out some others that are very, very important. So one way to go about it is the second part of your question, namely, well, if it's really wise, how is it distinct, not separate, but how is it distinguished from knowledge, which in turn can be distinguished or without separated from information. So for me, wisdom has the kind of depth and scope that it includes the widest possible range of knowledge without conflict, in a way that is harmonizing. So it includes a very wide range of perspectives that can somehow be sustained without conflict, contradiction, sort of a crackle.
I've read this essay. What's love got to do with it?
That's love got to do with it is that love, for me, is close to wisdom in that it is the state or the activity which affirms the deepest, most fundamental range of alternatives which would otherwise be in conflict. So love lifts the conflicts to a higher and truer synthesis.
Thank you. More questions? Thank you, Agent.
Does anybody else want to respond? That's a very important question. Please, and then I have some.
My response is brief. I think of wisdom as the sort of knowledge that answers the question, so what? You know, because knowledge on its own, you know, I think about, you know, children learning math and looking at word problems about buying, you know, 5 oranges plus 8 oranges, and there's, you know, a little kid would say, well, I hate oranges, so this is irrelevant. So it's really knowledge with a certain purpose. And I would say that the deepest wisdom is knowledge that has its purpose, the well-being of all beings.
Thank you.
Nice segue. I'd like to give a Western philosophical response and then an Asian, and the latter really segueing from what Alka said. We may or may not remember that the question of what is wisdom in its Greek form, Sophia, was thematized very, very early on. And the patron saint of these, to use a mixed metaphor, was Plato. And there was the question, there was a group of folks who later were called sophists, and they claimed, or at least the later tradition said, these are the people who have a definition of wisdom, and then they teach it. And then there was another group that said, well, maybe we should have a kind of open-ended acknowledgement that there's a multiplicity of perspectives, and what's most radical, and perhaps the real so what, is the search, the love, the urge, the craving for wisdom, the philos, the love of wisdom. And so we have the word philos Sophia. And ever since, those who yearn, for whatever reasons, to have a kind of settled sense of definitions of wisdom get labeled sophists. And I would say that when those sophists are in power relationships, you know, what did you dream? Oh, that's right, we told you what to dream, said the talking heads. In other words, we told you the definitions you have to learn, right? The Romans had people learn Latin when they went into different areas. They had to learn Latin, and the suppression of native languages. So the search for wisdom, being open, multiple perspectives, philosophy, different from sophists, they're settled. Asian perspective, wisdom, we've heard of wisdom and compassion. Wisdom is said in these traditions to be the practice of seeking out open-ended, multiple, heterogeneous perspectives on everything. And Trungpa Rinpoche once said, the bad news is we are all falling in space. The good news is none of us will ever land anywhere. But it's kind of a response to the silence of infinite space. What is the proof that one is continuing the quest and being renewed or enriched by this wisdom, this openness, this multiplicity of perspectives? Increased, robust, empathetic connection with living beings. That's a compassion. Compassion is the test, the diagnostic test of whether or not, at least in certain Buddhist traditions, one is authentically practicing wisdom. Otherwise, it's a kind of maybe narcissistic, power-related holding pattern that then can be enforced on others. Thich Nhat Hanh said in Being Peace, the first aspect of the path to true happiness is right view, which means to be open to the multiplicity of views and know that all views are partial. And he said that one should practice to never be conditioned by views, including the views, said the Buddha, of Buddhist teachings. And Thich Nhat Hanh was particularly concerned about children, and that how parents imagine, Steinerian or otherwise, teaching children to question authority, but with a kind of loving attention to the multiplicity of perspectives. So that's wisdom seeding at the level of kids.
Okay.
So I was the oranges kid that Alka mentioned, and, which is why I'm not very good with definitions. But what I do try to do is understand things through stories and anecdotes. So when I was in high school, I responded to having the tar beat out of me by a bully by knocking him out at lunchtime. And then I expressed my displeasure with the school by lighting it on fire. Fortunately, the police were close by, so they put it out before it got, really bad. And I'm mentioning this because my grandparents happened to be visiting my family when this happened. And so my parents, of course, were mortified and angry and everything that a parent would be in a situation like that. So I didn't have a good, meaningful, deep talk with them at the moment. But my grandfather pulled me aside. And he said, so about hitting the kid and lighting the fire, what was that all about? And so I told him, I was scared of this kid. He was beating me and my friends up, and this was my only response, blah, blah, blah. And he heard me out. And then in a very accepting, non-judgmental way that really impressed me and helped me feel stable and grounded and like myself. And we had a good talk about it. And then at the end of it, he said, so as you look back on what happened and what you did, what would you say the gain for those things was? The attempt to hit back and light the fire and all that. What did you gain from that? And I said, I can't honestly say that there was any gain. And my grandfather said, in revenge, there never is. So that was, for me, a piece of wisdom right there that I very much needed.
We'll define. We've got more questions over there. Here, Joe. Did you have the microphone still? There,
No.
Thank you. We're opening up questions.
Thank you. Yes, I wanted to follow up a little bit on Adrian's question because in the presentation, which I respected enormously. Another sign, symbol, and significance of what the Institute is all about. But I also am wondering in terms of definitions. We looked at the 16th century and the narratives that came out of that, and we looked at the Greeks and the Romans and the narratives that came out about that. What I was kind of missing in the ancient wisdom traditions and the Gnostic traditions is I didn't hear much about that. To me, it feels like that's the bedrock of where we're all coming from tonight. And that if we were to look at these ancient narratives versus others that are really much later, how would that change the narrative, for example, of Hokmah and Sophia, and that are so apparent both pre the canonical traditions and then become subsumed in the canonical traditions. So they're pre, and then they begin to disappear in these canonical conditions. And so some of the things that I heard, and Craig, it's always especially so appealing to me to have an opportunity to hear you speak again. And when you're speaking of Terra psychology or eco-psychology or eminence, or Steve and I heard hints of what you were saying, for example, for dissertation students. We have dissertation students that are so in the way, it's very hard for the text to actually ever really come to alive. And then we have others that are truly, they're conduits in the process, which seems very wisdom-based into these ancient pre-canonical and canonical texts. So I'm wondering if we were to look at the base, at the origins, would it change the narrative or the story at all that we have heard tonight?
To look at the gnosis itself.
Well, to look at wisdom traditions, as I said, pre-canonical, which they were very much in existence then, and then they began to get subsumed, especially in the New Testament and the Hebrew Bible, a lot in Genesis especially, and how the tree of wisdom, and that changes drastically.
So each of our panelists spoke from their specialty. Can somebody address this? Yeah,
I'd like to tell a fragment of a Gnostic story that's probably older than 2,000 years. They had a different version of Genesis than the one that some of us are used to. So in their version, in one of their versions, because the Gnostics tried to avoid something that they referred to as hylicism, which is an old word for literalizing, reifying, turning a story into an ideology. They try to keep their, as far as we can tell, they try to keep their stories alive and subject to multiple interpretations. But in the fragment that I'm thinking of, it's actually Eve who's born first, and as a direct emanation of Sophia, the wisdom goddess who lives in the 8th realm between heaven and earth. And when Adam is created, he's created by beings that the Gnostics refer to as archons. And you could think of them as really heavy-duty power principles. The name literally means rulers. So the rulers create Adam, and they're afraid of him when he comes to consciousness. So they deprive him of his ability to move around, and they just kind of leave him on the ground flopping there and go their way to wreak other havoc in the world. They're messing up Sophia's creation by doing this. So Eve, being a messenger of light, directly connected to Sophia, finds Adam just kind of laying there like this, you know, flopping around like a fish on the ground. And she calls him by his name and says, "Adam, awaken and beware of the deep sleep," which the Gnostics, today we would say beware of unconsciousness, culturally called unconsciousness. And Adam wakes up and gets up off the ground and says, "You will be known as the mother of all life." And it was to your voice I responded. And so sometimes when I think about that story, it makes me wonder what would have happened if that had been the version that a lot of us grew up with instead of the other one.
Great. News to me. And shall we get our microphone over here? Is that address? Enough of what you want? Thank you.
Hi, I'm just wondering, in the 4 decades that CIIS has been, what do you see as the evolution in your course offerings, and especially recently with the mainstream interest in mindfulness, and how has all this affected what do you guys do here?
Very good.
Yeah.
As a former president of the Institute, you can really look at trajectory and
Very
future.
good question.
Yeah.
We definitely didn't give that question. Okay.
Microphone closer.
So, I don't think any of us has all the parts to be able to answer that question. So it's going to be whoever responds. It will be our president over there, our current president, who was president longer than I was. It'll be somewhat anecdotal. We haven't done data collecting on that question. Though we have some data about who we are and who we've been. Trying to answer. When this institution, California Institute of Integral Studies, originally called Asian Studies, was founded in 1968. It was founded by 2 people, husband and wife, and particularly by the man who was an accomplished philosopher, spiritual teacher, meditation teacher, East-West person, fundraiser, administrator, and very charismatic. So, yeah, really all the parts, and a very, very smart, tough wife. So they really were a great team. And so if he had not died at age 65 after 7 years, the school, I think, would have evolved much more quickly and I think securely. Right? That said, the school then, and for some years after, was confused, ambivalent about whether it wanted to be a graduate school or wanted to be an ashram, and if it wanted to do both, it wasn't sure that it knew how to do it, or there were lots of opinions about how that could happen. I would say that through the 80s and some of the 90s, the school, both deliberately and of necessity, maybe even some external pressures, definitely selected the accredited graduate education model with as much interior, spiritual, affective dimension as the group could sustain within those strictures. All right. I would say at the present time, let's say the last, maybe 10 years, I think many people in the school are more conscious, more determined to sustain or develop that interior dimension because the fear of losing it is more real. Mm-hmm. So I think there is a sense that we are very successful now. We're really respected academically. We have good scholars, good students, balanced budget, all kinds of good things. And that satisfaction can work against the risk of teaching, practicing, honoring, being public about spiritual practice, spiritual ideals, and some courses we teach that are outside the dominant paradigm. So I'd say we're in a healthy tension. We haven't lost our mission, but it is always in jeopardy. It's a little bit like freedom. It's always at risk. That's how I read it. I don't know whether our president wants to.
I would agree. Thank you.
Nicely said.
Perfect.
Nicely said.
And you're a good reason for the sustaining and deepening of the spiritual dimension of the school, truly.
And that includes within our I don't need that, thank you. That includes within our School of Professional Psychology and Health as well, which is always challenged by state mandated and federally guided prescriptives for what an academic curricula is all about. And as such, we're always holding that tension of reinforcing with our students a self-care practice, a spiritual practice, an embodied practice. And I would say CIIS, and I've taught at other universities, is one of the only places I know where you can still do some deep spiritual reflection in an academic paper. And maybe we have guidelines now that no, not 70% of your paper, maybe 30% of your paper, but it's always kind of a finely tuned, nuanced tension that is held. I like the fact that it is a dynamic tension always being discussed. Thank you. Other questions out there? Wisdom, what are you passionate about? Yes, over there in the corner as well. Okay, but he had his hand up first. Yes.
So to talk about technology and wisdom as it applies is very interesting to me. I work for a company where it's all talk about exponential technology and just really pursuing what's the next biggest thing and how this is going to change society. But one of the things I've noticed about the company I've worked for is there's a little bit of lip service in terms of how is this going to affect people, but it's not how is this going to affect people, should we pursue this? You know, and I feel that's kind of what can be said overall as a Western society. We're so focused on progression, we almost, in my mind, need something like Amish communities, where they don't just, they're not technologically Luddites as they're, really portrayed. They honestly talk about how is this going to affect our community. So I guess my question would be, how can we as a society, beyond politics and that, how can we, question what we are pursuing and what we're doing before we just kind of rush into technology as answers for everything?
Great question.
We all want to answer that.
Yeah.
We all want to discuss that.
Yeah. That's partly what we're here for as a school. We're in the in-between space between the stimulus and the response, making space for reflection on what we do and why we feel the way that we do and where we should go. So that's part of it for us as educators. And also, I think, well, one of the reasons I'm such a fan of the humanities, besides all the good stories, is they allow us to learn from our mistakes. So when you see other examples, or even mythic examples of what happens when you get possessed by Promethean enthusiasm, and you go rushing headlong into things like that, projects, then there's very clear examples. One of them actually is at the bottom of the ocean right now. It's called the RMS Titanic. And the odd thing too about that from a mythic standpoint is that in ancient Greek mythology, the Titans were a race of giants who were in a really big hurry to do things fast their way. And they fought against the rightful gods, the Olympians, and they lost. So Zeus, to prevent them from making more trouble as out of control giants, locked them up in a box and put them on the bottom of the ocean, where the Titanic ended up. So Titanism might be a word for that which we should avoid unless we want to have the same fate as a civilization. And on a lighter note, there's also in folklore there's stories like the Sorcerer's Apprentice, where the young magician thought he knew what he was doing and he got all the tools to sweep and do all the other housework for him because he didn't feel like it, and then they got their own agenda. And as one of the creators of the atomic bomb put it, the tools get hold of you. And so stories like that can tell us too. And by the way, that story has a good ending because the real magician comes home, the elder magician, the one who knows how things work, and he stops it. So our elders need to be in all of this too somewhere, our elders as a culture, instead of being shoved aside. We need their wisdom and their stories and their history.
Thank you for a great question. I think we've got more people to answer the question of the tyranny of production and consumption.
Well, I think that sort of ties back to my earlier statement about, but also the wisdom of so what, right? What is the ultimate ends of these technology? And my other statement earlier on is for whom and who benefits from this? And I think in order to ask those sorts of questions, we all have to be sort of critical thinkers in terms of questioning you know, is this just for the stockholders, for the CEO, for a certain segment of the population? And honestly have some of a critique of this capitalism that has no limits, right? Because what it really is about is endless growth to where, right? And it's currently it seems like it may be to ecological destruction. And I think that it really takes each citizen asking those questions, not to say that there isn't a value of technology, but to say what are ways in which technology might be used to actually help remedy some of the ecological crises that we fit in, and to factor in the for whom and the so what, not only for humans, but for all life.
First of all, thanks for your question. Today, you may know that Google, Facebook, and a few others officially filed with the Department of Justice a cease and desist the rampant excesses, according to them, of NSA gathering, which is interesting. Maybe the Jolly Roger flag of do no evil will be hoisted again. And about a week ago, you know, I went to UC Berkeley as an undergraduate, Berkeley, so, you know, left coast, left, capitalism, and now that I'm slightly older, you know, having had to support a family, etc., and having spent a stint in the business world, there's actually living people who, at their core, want to do well, don't want to do evil. Sometimes they're stuck in jobs at the higher echelons, whatever, or they were seeking a visionary venue for really ameliorating a lot of the bad things, and then after time they got, you know, dragged down. So I think this is not just a corporation problem, it's a kind of human collectivity problem. CVS, you may or may not have heard, decided to totally stop selling all tobacco products in October, taking a $2 billion hit. And you know, we'll read what really happened, but the visionary CEO might be the current equivalent or an instantiation of the hero. There used to be a time in the 19th century, the world historical figure, where certain individuals, given where they're placed at a certain point, and we find this in Greek myth too, can affect a great leveraging of moral awareness. And we know about the tyrants in power and power corrupting, but also those in a leadership position in corporations at the very top. And I know, you know, there's a lot of stuff about how to be a better CEO or a CFO and optimize, but what's your vision? What's your game plan? Is your mission? And so it turns out that if, at least versions that I knew, if you're only concerned about the bottom line, then that's not a mission. And at a certain point, the shareholders are going to be disappointed. You need a certain percentage of pure research or visioning for the development of actual products going online too, on stream, to make a difference. So I would say the more that decision makers within corporations can be exposed to all the wonderful stuff that Google and others are doing in terms of Wisdom 2.0 is a great beginning of a response to your question.
Thank you. Is there one more response here?
I could, but you want to do another question or what?
If there's a burning question out there, we only have 10 more minutes. Let's see if we can't field a few more.
Oh,
Right
yeah,
in the
chat.
Hi, thank you. It was an amazing presentation by everyone. I really enjoyed it. And I wanted to address Adrian's question briefly. To me, the difference between knowledge and wisdom is knowledge is temporal. It's something you learn in the moment. And wisdom is knowledge that becomes instilled and transcends time. So it's something that you learn that becomes cellular and becomes a part of your being and actually lives with you, in you, through lifetimes. And therefore you've gained the knowledge through the experience. And often I think a lot of wisdom comes through suffering. That's just on that note. And then on the other question on like where do we see the future of CIIS kind of moving, I'm a TA for Richard Tarnas in the PCC program, and he's written 2 books, Passion of the Western Mind and Cosmos and Psyche, and they together describe an enchanted universe where the human psyche is mirrored and reflected in the largest movements of nature, the largest patterns in nature that we're aware of. And so it seems as though the universe, the cosmos, is allowing us, is providing this opportunity for us to gain a relationship with the depths of the interiority of our psyche that is mirrored and reflected in the movements of the planets. And that will potentially, if it is realized, it embeds every human being. It recenters the cosmos, not on the earth, but on every individual human being. You are a center of meaning and purpose. And the locus is your natal chart, and then the transits that follow is how your life and your psyche unfolds through time. So I have deep, tremendous hope that we're going to make it through this crisis in our civilization, and there is a new story on the other side where we can actually enter into a genuine relationship with the creative intelligence of the cosmos, the archetypes, ultimately. So.
Well, thank you. I didn't hear a question in there, but I heard a commentary from a passionate CIIS student, which is
Right over there.
very exciting, very exciting.
Questions?
Question over here.
It's really a great panel discussion, and I'm very delighted to be here and hear what the faculties and professors are talking about. Just one small question, probably not really small, because I'm from the higher education field as well, and so in order to really help students gain wisdom, instead of being just improve their knowledge of wisdom, so how CIIS has been done in this field? Thanks.
How to gain wisdom versus just the knowledge of wisdom. Wow. I know, we've looked at that. How are you instilling that depth of inquiry in self-care practices or spiritual practices? And is that a part of our mission?
Well, I think we begin with wisdom. Wisdom is the end point. Knowledge, as I understand it, is essential on the way to wisdom. So it's not a waste at all for us to be teaching knowledge and knowledge of wisdom in the hope that faculty and students together will actually gain some wisdom, which I want to emphasize in my view is always, you know, it's a different point of view from Chad. From my point of view, it's always tentative and temporary. Because it's based on relationships, and relationships are always changing. So wisdom for me is a jump in level, whether you say higher or deeper. I'm content either way. But what I think is that it's not surface. So if we accumulate a lot of knowledge, I think we're in a position then to switch to gain access to another level. We can go to the other level with very little knowledge, but I believe that the transition to a higher, deeper level will prove insufficient and will require us to get more knowledge. So these, to my mind, are not separable. They are two different levels that are always working together. And to think that we have wisdom without knowledge, I think, is probably presumption. And to think that we have wisdom just because we have ordinary kind of knowledge, I think is giving up too easily. It's giving up prematurely.
Are you satisfied with that answer? Do you want more?
Some other responses.
Yeah, other responses.
Thank you.
More specific,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
the program setting, the teaching curriculum, how do the professors help students improve their wisdom?
Thank you, I'd be happy to do that. In the Women's Spirituality program, here many of us employ what I call an integral feminist pedagogy. And the feminist pedagogy draws a lot from, critical theory and folks like bell hooks and Paulo Freire, who was a Brazilian philosopher, who really critiqued what he called the banking model of education, where the instructor simply deposits their knowledge into the minds of the students, and argued that that was really a way of maintaining power and privilege. And that in order to disrupt that, we had to sort of engage in allowing the student to also be a producer of knowledge that's sharing with the knowledge that they have in the classroom. So for instance, in classrooms in the Women's Spirituality program, that often means that we don't, we may have content that we want to deliver and lectures and so on and so forth, but that's generally not the core focus. It's oftentimes more of a dialogical process where we sit and we allow each person to sort of share their wisdom and their experience and their knowledge from their own life experience. But it's not done in a vacuum where it's just about personal opinions, but it's critical reflection on one's experience in dialogue with the others in the room and with the text that we are reading. So it's, Freire talked about this concept of praxis, which is reflection and action. So there's always this ongoing process of you learn from the expertise of the instructor as well as through your own reflection, and that reflection could be through journaling, through, simply contemplating, as part of your work outside of the classroom. But then coming back in and having that deep dialogue. And for me, one of the things that I really stress as an educator, particularly at the graduate level, is that it's not so much about can I give the students the answers, but can I help facilitate them asking the right questions? And then the integral piece of that integral feminist pedagogy is also recognizing that some of the wisdom that the students and the instructor will bring to the classroom comes from having our own practices where we go and explore the interior dimensions. So we're not cutting ourselves off, where this is a place where we can only bring our minds and our hearts and our spirits have to be left at home, but that we can bring all of that into the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Perhaps a model that some of us who are educators, and I don't know at what level, we were blessed and cursed to primarily teach MA and PhD students. The few times that I've had to teach undergraduates, like at Rice University, it's just been a tsunami of multiple questioning and excitement. So it's a little bit limited in the hothouse of graduate. So, and we're all on a committee, a research committee, where and Craig heads it up, and we're all on it. We are asking this question of our MA and our PhD programs, both in their particularity and then across the vision of CIIS. And the background is, given our mission ideals, how can we assess, how could we even know what would count, right? And so something that we've come up with, and there's different ways to talk about this, there's the knowledge base, which is what 99% of what most graduate schools and professional schools are. And then there's the skill set, but the skill set can be two different things. Traditionally it is how to have continual learning, how to pose graduate questions. Now we're adding social media and all of that, but Alka just mentioned another skill set which one only hears about when experience is valorized as a skill set. So imagine a deep inquiry experience of the student and the professor and other students in dialogue as a skill set. You might call it meditation, you might call it group depth work, and I would say what's not unique, but very special about CIIS, and I wish this happened more places at the graduate level, is really encouraging, cajoling, provoking, joyously applauding students to come forth with their voices regarding a kind of critical inquiry as a skill set into the depth of their experience, either for producing new knowledge or something else. And so experiential exploration as a skill set, I'd say, was a unique feature that we're looking at CIIS to really thematize. Footnote, how do you assess that? That's interesting, who knows? So hopefully that's a bit of a response. Experience.
Thank you very much.
I have just one more footnote on that. I chair the Masters in Integrative Health, and it's a requirement within that program that students have an embodied practice as well. And about 70% of them, it includes yoga. But the rest are either in a Qigong practice, or some are doing a sort of a combined fitness, Pilates, yoga. They do all sorts of hybrid practices. But they have to have a somatic program on a daily basis, and they journal about it as well. And out of that embodied practice, we believe comes a real commitment and a deeper level of knowing and inquiry that they can engage with in the classroom. So there's different approaches, but for the most part, they all stem around our shared commitment to integral education. And Robert has always had a beautiful definition of that. I think we'll look for one more question, but I'd love to end with your definition of integral education.
That's got a question.
One more question back there first.
Thank
We're
you.
going to end with that later.
Thanks everyone for sharing your wisdom with us tonight. So my question is kind of dovetailing on this conversation about what are all these innovations and new technologies for, and it's but more about money. I think we're in probably one of the richest places here in the Bay Area that has ever existed on the planet before. But money now seems to have become the be-all and end-all value of our civilization, and I wonder what would it look like if wisdom was the value in the context of a world now where the economy obviously is very important, but how can we use the values associated with wisdom to redirect and sort of channel the flow of money in a way that's more helpful for the community of life on Earth?
Alternative economies?
So nursery teachers would be well paid, and corporations would hold a bake sale.
For starters. Craig, you've got an alternative economy in mind?
I was just thinking that when you were talking about two words, you said flow of money, which is great, because it seems to work good when it flows, hence the word currency.
Right.
And the word money comes from the name of a goddess, Moneta. She was a bit like Hera, and in Roman temples where they would keep the money, there were actually altars to Moneta. So I'm chair of East West Psychology, and there's a couple of students who've been doing some work on something they refer to as sacred commerce. What would it look like to actually have a conscious and even sacred relationship to money? So it's not a full answer to what you asked, but I feel really hopeful about those directions that this is all taking. And I would just add too that there's also a lot of psychology in money, and it could stand some analysis. So if you think about terms like depression and inflation, those are psychiatric terms. And there's also some mythology there too, besides Moneta. There's the witching hour. If you get depressed about your revenues, you go to your analyst, right? So some light shed on all that too.
I'm not an expert on money, but one of my favorite books about money is by George Kidder, called The Seven Stages of Money. It's been a time since I read it, but it concludes with the chapter of sort of what would it be like to be successful in your handling of money. That's called the Bodhisattva chapter, which means that that's when money goes through you as currency without it getting stuck. So it doesn't own you, and you don't get stuck holding it, but it's really like blood. and it flows. And my favorite example of that, which is not in the book, but it could be, is when George Soros, who knows a lot about money, gave away $35 billion without naming anything after himself. So he still had plenty left, I'm not saying that. But he did understand that the really great way to deal with money is to put it in circulation without controlling it by your name or your fame or your institution. We could do that at our own very, very ordinary level of just not even if we have very little money, we can work to have it move through us and not have us try to sort of stop the flow. Do you want me to do this? Or what?
We're going to do one more comment, a very short one, from Stephen first, and I want to acknowledge the passion of your question, too. That's what students come here with.
They also come with the most unprecedented debt in U.S. history. Judy Wexler, our dean, she could be here today, but it's being taped, told a story at faculty that when she was able to buy her first house, it cost less than the average debt of students. The 400-pound elephant, or whatever analogy you want to give, of the incredible undemocratic servitude and chattel that, voluntarily or not, our beloved children and soon grandchildren are going into higher education, is one of the great conundrums, one of the great challenges. We've come a long way from land-grant colleges and kind of vision the Enlightenment, the positive sense of the Enlightenment of spreading knowledge by through universal access to education has been deeply, deeply threatened. So I would hope that the high-tech companies would start, Google, Twitter, and whatever, universities, or give grants to, they do it for tech, and we've talked about internship, but it's really a great crisis. So it's one thing to have an asked question about, well, what's a sacred relationship to commerce, but it's a little bit like, if I might say, fiddling while Rome burns. We want to have that vision, but Rome is burning, And I think the ecological crisis, the inequities that we have, and before the big earthquake, which will change a few things in California, we have this opportunity to really seed a generation of people that have a vision without somehow having them enslaved. It'd be great if they could pay off or be forgiven their debts if they did service, like CCC during FDR's time. All of this is possible. If the last thing I want to say about wisdom, you may know, right, in the darkest of times, the owl of Minerva, that symbol of wisdom, takes off at what time? Midnight, in the darkest hour. So stay tuned.
Thank you. Let's look at wrapping up now. We've only got a few more minutes. I think we've handled most of your questions, and I wanted Robert, who gives a very eloquent definition of integral education, because to me it is the wellspring of wisdom. And when you talk about, yeah, before.
I know, I do know.
Just a little kickstart, please.
So I actually think that integral at the Institute at the present time is mostly thought of as body, mind, and spirit. All right, and that's fine. Any version which keeps us from disliking and distrusting each other is probably a good thing. And lots of people feel comfortable with body, mind, and spirit. It's quite serviceable. It's helpful in many, many ways. The origin of integral in the writings of Sri Aurobindo, who, 2 or 3 generations back, is the inspiration of our founder, who's the inspiration of the school, really came from the yogas, the spiritual disciplines of the Bhagavad Gita, which taught knowledge, action, love, and contemplation. And there's lots of arguments, there's lots of books written about which is the highest or the best or the most basic, and is there any one that unifies the other? And you know, we could name, well, this guy says, etc. But it's probably pretty clear that the one that unifies the others is love. So that knowledge can be love, and action can and better be love, and contemplation, which is successful, is also an act of love, not a you know, a competitive activity to see, you know, how long you can meditate, or, you know, whether you get some new ideas. So that is at the core of the school's mission and vision and discipline. Not everyone thinks of those disciplines, but I think if people hear them, they recognize, oh yeah. And I think we also could move over and do body, mind, and spirit, and get most, if not all, of what we would get with the original version, though there might be some loss either way. And nobody's in charge of this. The school evolves, grows, deepens, expands, and is an ongoing dynamic process without anybody able to you know, kind of to damn it or to push it ahead by a fiat. It's a complex institution, as a president can tell you. So, is that what you're looking for?
That is exactly what I want.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you for attending tonight. I hope you see this as an adventurous. Interactions with CIIS. Thank you for coming.
Great job.
It's been great.
Very good.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Nice job. Nice job. She's good at it.